And we're back to part 3 of chapter 9, the television chapter. I want to talk a little bit about the transition from the sort of fantasy world of the 1960s, the late 1960s television, to some harder hitting stuff that came along in the 1970s. The Brady Bunch, which I'm sure you've either seen or seen in reruns, started back in 1969 and lasted 5 years. It seemed like it was on the air a lot longer, but it's been in reruns so long that that's probably why. The Brady Bunch actually was a continuation of sort of the fantasy world of the 1960s programming, in that the problems in the family were never very huge. You know, Marcia gets a bump on her nose, and can't go to the dance, or Greg isn't one of the popular guys, or Cindy gets a new dress. It's not earth-shattering types of problems that we might face or think about facing in the world today. But there was something different about the show that was kind of a first, and it had what we might call a blended family. It was a man who had 3 sons who married a woman with 3 daughters, and the whole idea that divorce and the repercussions of that could be shown to be a positive thing on the air, or could be shown at all, was something that was a little bit groundbreaking. So even though the problems that the family faced in their sort of idealized suburban backdrop were not terribly difficult, they did have to deal occasionally with the problems of the fact that interests from one side of the family might conflict with the other. The start of some of the other shows that really changed things included the Mary Tyler Moore Show from 1970 to 77. And this was about an unmarried, independent career woman who controlled her own life. And it doesn't sound all that remarkable today, but it was kind of a groundbreaking program then. A woman who could decide for herself what career she wanted, could decide for herself whether or not she had to have a husband or be married or have a boyfriend even. She could determine how to navigate her way through the tough world of cranky bosses, and try to make friends and survive in a very urban environment. So for its time, pretty groundbreaking. Even more groundbreaking, the movie, or the TV show All in the Family, which aired for 8 years, from 1971 to 79. Now, the lead role was played by Archie Bunker, or that was his name on the show, Carroll O'Connor, who was about the biggest racist, bigot, anti-feminist, homophobic type of guy you can imagine. He wasn't that way in real life, but he played that character on the show. And his wife was a servile, kind of serve her master, kind of old-fashioned woman. And his son-in-law, Mike, was who he called Meathead, was a hippie and had all these radical ideas about black power and helping people who were living in poverty. And their daughter was sort of a feminist in her own right. So that show is all about Archie's becoming aware of the fact that he lived in a world that was changing, and he didn't like it very much. And they had lots of guest stars, people that would come on, and he would get very angry and fly into a rage whenever his core values, as he called them, his beliefs, were challenged. There was one particular episode when Sammy Davis Jr., a black actor at the time and singer and musician, very important television person and personality, came on the show, and he met Archie at the front door with a front kiss, with a kiss right on the lips. And of course, that was, that brought the house down. People at home, in homes all across America, were laughing, or they were getting really upset about it, because All in the Family was kind of a show that you got the joke, you got the fact that Archie was a bigot and a racist, and you hated him for that, or you took it literally and defended him. So very divisive thing, a very divisive show that brought up all kinds of issues that in America wasn't being dealt with in the 60s. Another show in the 70s, Maude, came along, 1972 to 1978, And B. Arthur played the title role, and later was part of the group, I believe, in the show The Golden Girls. But she dealt with feminism, abortion, divorce, her own alcoholism and depression, and a very successful television series that finally started bringing, like All in the Family, some of these issues that were of everyday concern to ordinary people into the forefront and dealing with them on television in an entertaining but dramatic and sometimes scary way. A few other things happened in the 70s. I mean, you could literally list thousands of television programs that were influential. But one of the ones that I wanted to talk about, and it's barely mentioned in the textbook, was comedies in the 1970s and how they dealt with social issues. There was a show called The Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour. It's just called The Smothers Brothers for show. From the mid 60s until 1970, and there's a photograph of the two guys that were on the show there in the bottom left, and it was meant to be this sort of old-fashioned fun show. They played folk instruments, an upright bass, and a guitar, and they had all these kind of corny jokes and random things, but masking behind those, and sometimes not masking those, were statements and songs about the Vietnam War, the war on drugs, other kinds of political commentary. A lot of really good 1970s comics wrote for the show. A lot of people who later made it on their own as good comedians in the 70s and 80s and made it onto Saturday Night Live and other places. Steve Martin, for example, was one of the comedy writers for the show. They got into so much trouble they got yanked off the air a couple of times and finally had to go away because they were just too on the cutting edge of the things that made the establishment, the power establishment, upset. Laugh-In came along in 1968 and lasted about 5 years also, and it was actually called Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. It was a really silly show, had really silly humor with corny jokes and stereotypical type of dumb blonde jokes and things like that. Very mild satire. But it also served a purpose to kind of get some digs in at the establishment there. Former President Richard Nixon actually appeared on the show. He was a man not known for his sense of humor. I had the opportunity to interview him years ago, and he had no sense of humor of which he's aware, but he kind of was one of the first presidents to go on television, not the first, to kind of have fun made at his own expense. And it was kind of an interesting experience because one of the running punchlines on the show was "Sock it to me," just sock it to me, baby. And it didn't really mean anything. It was just a catchphrase. But to hear Richard Nixon say that on the program in his gravelly little voice, "Oh, sock it to me," was kind of morbidly fascinating for television audiences all across America. And of course, I'm sure you're all familiar with Saturday Night Live, which has been on the air since 1975. There's a photo of the original cast there with John Belushi, Gilda Radner, Dan Aykroyd, Jane Curtin, Lorraine Newman, Chevy Chase, and Garrett Morris, I believe is all of them. And it has come and gone as far as its popularity. In the beginning, it was very successful with some very, what I would call, biting parodies of popular culture, makes fun of politicians. Of course, they always have musical groups on, and sometimes that's gone well, sometimes it hasn't. At times, this show has really been on the cutting edge of kind of telling America what's going on in the world, and I think right now we're seeing that with all the parodies of Trump and the Trump White House and the administration. Some really spot-on caricatures of the way things are going in the administration, whether you like Trump or not. They're cutting to the edge of what Americans are thinking about right now, and that's what a good comedy show like this and other comedy shows that deal with social issues try to do. They try to get their finger on the pulse of America. So if you have a chance to ever go back and watch some of the very first episodes, I remember tuning in to watch the very first episode in 1975, and it's hilarious stuff. The comedy holds up even today, most of it. And it's been an important show on American television for quite a long time, and it's worth thinking about its impact on our society. Now, the book, as far as I could tell, didn't really pay much attention to what I would call black sitcoms, and I think that's too bad. So I've created a whole slide here just for them, because one of the things that wasn't just, we weren't all just growing in a vacuum with just shows for white people. There were plenty of shows, and this list is taken from a couple of different websites that I've kind of cobbled together of some of the most important black sitcoms from the late 60s until the 2000s, and of course there's more modern ones that could be listed here. But these were important because they gave something for some black people, a space for them to celebrate their heritage, take pride in themselves, to celebrate their accomplishments. It also gave non-black audiences a chance to see how black families were or could be. And of course, the difficulty with all kinds of television programming, whether it's for white or black or Spanish or anybody, any other race, Vietnamese, is that it relies on stereotypes, and especially for comedy and humor. We rely on stereotypes because we recognize stereotypes. So some of these shows contained a lot of stereotypes, but they were important in the history of television nonetheless. And a show that you may not be familiar with called Julia came on in 1968 and was groundbreaking in a lot of ways. There's a TV Guide cover where Diane Carroll, who played Julia, is on along with her son. And she was a nurse on the show and had to deal with real-life problems of a single mother. She was respectably middle class, and so she didn't live in poverty. She tried to get the best opportunities for her son. She spent a lot of time with him. And yes, there were stereotypes on the show, a little bit of patronization from white people on the show, but it was an important landmark show that isn't mentioned very often in terms of black programming. Sanford and Son, a comedy that came along in the early to mid-70s, was really funny. It was based on the comedy of Red Fox. Red Fox on the show played a very mild-mannered junk man. In reality, his stand-up comedy is really pretty blue, as they say. Blue meaning it's pretty vulgar at times. A lot of us grew up on Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids. Good Times, which is pictured there with Jimmy Walker, had a really big following for a long time. The Jeffersons, Different Strokes, The Cosby Show. No matter what you might think of Bill Cosby now, he's had there have been allegations that he was involved in, I guess you would call it date raping some women. But the show itself was a breakthrough comedy showing that an upper scale black family could be successful. He played I believe he and Felicia Rashad both played doctors on the show. A Different World, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I still love that show. I still watch it. Martin, the Wayans brothers, Moesha, a photograph of the cast there. Bernie Mac was another show that didn't last on the air as long as it probably should have. And of course, Bernie passed away, but very good show. Everybody Hates Chris, which was very popular, and there have been many shows since then. But this just gives you a sample. Maybe you didn't think about it over the years. Some of the shows you've seen either when you were younger or in reruns, how important black sitcoms really were to American television. And because the book didn't really talk about it, I wanted to make sure that I mentioned some of these. And I talked about how they contributed to the portrayal of African Americans in this country. I also want to talk in general about reality TV and the sort of instant celebrity that leads to that. The first really, well, there were others, but the first really well-known example of reality TV show was called Candid Camera. It came out in 1948. It was hosted by a man named Alan Funt. It was on the air off and on for many years. It was derived from a radio program. And it was basically a hidden camera, hidden microphone show. They would put people on the spot, and they would film them, of course, and later videotape them, doing silly things, and then they reveal to them that they were being filmed or videotaped by saying, "Smile, you're on candid camera." And people really liked it, and there have been so many reality TV shows, and I'm just looking at some of the basic ones here that we're probably most familiar with: America's Funniest Home Videos, America's Most Wanted, Cops, Big Brother, Jersey Shore. Remember Jersey Shore? And Survivor, The Real World, The Bachelor, American Idol, The Voice nowadays. And that's not even taking into account all the cooking reality shows, the fashion reality shows. The list goes on and on and on. And I guess that one of the reasons that reality shows appeal to us is that they get us out of our own little world and put us in another place, transport us temporarily. And that's what good media does anyway. Whether it's radio programming back in the 30s and 40s that has us over in Europe when the battles are being fought, or sitting in the movie theater experiencing a whole nother world like in Jurassic Park, or sitting in front of the TV and vegging out and taking time away from our troubles and cares to kind of live in this other world with lots of other people. And again, like I said, we could talk about thousands of television shows, whatever your favorites are, but these are some of the things, some of the genres that I think are important for us to remember and care about. Now, a little bit about early television in terms of corporate sponsorship. When television first started coming on, particularly in the 1940s and 50s, television programs often had a single sponsor. And by that I mean it might be a show like the Colgate Comedy Hour. And Colgate, which of course makes toothpaste and toothbrushes and all kinds of dental hygiene stuff, would sponsor an entire half-hour-long show or an entire hour-long show. And they would be the only ones that would get commercial breaks. And there wouldn't be very many of them. Sometimes it would stay at the very start of a show, like you see in the graphic in the upper right, the Colgate Comedy Hour. That would be there on the screen. There would be an announcement about that, and then maybe halfway through the show there'd be another one, and then at the end there'd be another one. And those sponsors were very key because they paid the bills. In the 1950s, a television show for an hour cost about $35,000 to make in 1952. So having somebody foot that whole bill was very beneficial. The difficulty was that these single sponsors often influenced the content. So if there was somebody they didn't want on the air for whatever reason, or some message or some performer they did want on the air, then they would have the final say over that. The networks didn't have as much say as they wanted to. So as the costs rose, up to about $90,000 per hour in 1959 to put on one television show, the network started looking for other outlets, other ways to raise money, and they came with this concept of actual commercials, 1 to 2 minute blocks of commercials, which is what we see nowadays. A 1 minute commercial or a 30-second commercial, sometimes a little longer than a minute, but often not. Sometimes a combination of 15, 30, and 60-second commercials. So this single sponsorship, by doing that, it meant that no one sponsor could control the content of a show, and the networks had control, again, of what the content of a show was. Kind of a big deal. I want to mention also quiz shows. Of course, there's been a million quiz shows, but the one that really stands out in history is called the $64,000 Question, which ran for 3 years from 1955 to 1958. It was based on a radio show called the $64 Question, which was a phrase that was heard in America, kind of a slang phrase for years. Like, well, that's the $64 question, and I don't know the origin of that. But it led to a television show where they upped the ante a little bit. In this show, they didn't so much rig the questions, but there was a whole amount of it that was set up. Contestants would go into this booth that you see pictured here, and they would have to answer questions through a microphone and headset. But there were other games like Dotto and 21 and similar shows that were rigged so that certain contestants would win. And so eventually, because of the outcry and the scandal, the networks had to drop a lot of these early quiz shows. And quiz shows were heavily regulated for quite a while after that, and have been for quite a while too. It doesn't mean there haven't been tons of them since the 1950s. It's just that they've gone a long way towards making sure that they're not as rigged as they were letting people outright win. So in some sense, that cut back on sponsors' role in creating content. And of course, shows like the $64,000 question were precursors to Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and lots of other shows between those time frames. So, enough about that. I want to talk briefly about public television. This is actually a very fascinating area if you ever want to do a paper or some research on that. PBS, well, first of all, the Public Broadcasting Act was established in 1967, and PBS, the station that carries out that act, was established 2 years later. And this was a situation where, because most television was commercial, for-profit, some forces came together, some artistic and creative and governmental forces came together and decided to create a television network that financed educational, non-profit TV, the no advertising. So the idea was to give people a good educational programming without commercial interruption and without the need to have sponsors get too involved in the content. So they called for a diversity program appealing primarily to people under the age of 12, which is why you see shows like Sesame Street, which is there, and to people over 50, which is why you see Downton Abbey pictured there in the bottom left of the screen. Part of the language was designed for the forming PBS, was to enhance citizenship and public service, and you could argue that Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood did that. It was I don't know how many of you grew up watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, or whether it was already off the air by the time you were old enough to watch it. But very, very basic, simple, how to be a good person in society, citizenship type things were covered very frequently. And PBS also was designed to help people learn social skills and language. Some of the first closed captioning was on PBS. And a lot of immigrants actually learned to read by reading the closed captioning and watching children's shows, which had very simple vocabulary, and could learn how to read and write English by listening to the characters talk on some of the children's shows, particularly Mr. Rogers, who talked very slowly for children, and matching it to the captioning that showed up on their TV screen. It's an unusual phenomenon, but it really did happen. A little bit about cable. The book has, like I said, lots about cable TV, and I don't dwell on it too much. But cable did grow tremendously to the point where it's really challenging the regular TV networks. Between 1994 and 2009, the percentage of U.S. households watching network TV dropped tremendously, from 43% to only 27%. And two of the key reasons that cable started taking over from network TV is deregulation. Deregulation is a process where it allowed companies to own, for example, not just a TV station, but a TV station and a cable company, or to own 4 or 5 or 6 different businesses that were related to media. And the deregulation also allowed people to start new cable companies. And that encouraged competition, yes, and brought choices to the viewing public, yes, but the Cable Communications Policy Act in 1984 also allowed those new cable companies and the existing ones to raise their rates. So that's why we now see cable television costing relatively a fair amount of money. I mean, obviously it takes money to put on that extensive programming, but when you see tiers and tiers and tiers on cable network programs, that's to pay for that. So along with more choice and more channels and your ability to choose one provider over another, you also got some increases in price. The second reason cable started getting more popular is the increasing use of satellites to bring live content from around the world. not only in the news business like CNN and other 24-hour news networks, but just the ability to beam regular programming into our homes, and also the advent of pay-per-view, where you could pay to watch a particular boxing match or concert or other event. So we now have had a lot of different ways to watch television, starting kind of with the networks. And these are no particular chronological order, but they are a little bit. Video VCRs and DVRs, recording devices, of course, before there are a couple of different VCR. Beta came before VHS, but cable television, the war between cable and satellite, what's called VOD, which is important video on demand. Those are networks like Netflix, Cinemax, HBO. Satellite wars, DirecTV versus Dish Network. That's still going on, although not to as great a degree as it used to. The fact that television is now on the internet, and it's on YouTube and Hulu and lots of other places like that. And then now we have interactive TV. It's still not become really popular, but you physically take part in the programming, either by touching the screen or issuing voice commands or using some kind of a modified clicker. So we've gone to where, in the 50s, the networks, or actually before that, individuals controlling what was broadcast, to networks controlling what was broadcast, to various ways of recording it, to various ways of providing the information, the channels, the stations, through cable or satellite, through the internet itself, and then through subsidiary pieces of software like YouTube and Hulu, and you're watching this presentation right now on YouTube, and through interactive TV, which is going to become increasingly a bigger and bigger deal. A couple of more slides. This is recently from a site called Screener.com, which monitors the Nielsen ratings, and this is just last week. Top 10 cable shows in adults 18 to 49. And these are cable shows. These are not necessarily network TV. It just so happened that this Sunday of this week, The Walking Dead premiered again, and so naturally they got a huge rating on the AMC network. And the show that follows that is called The Talking Dead. It also got the number 2 slot. The Walking Dead Marathon got the number 3 slot because it was on Sunday evening. And then the shows after that followed. Love and Hip Hop, WWE Monday Night Raw, WWE Monday Night Raw, Gold Rush, college basketball, North Carolina Duke, and then finally rounding out the top 10, Real Housewives of Atlanta on Bravo. One more slide. These are top 10 syndicate shows. A couple weeks ago, not last week, same category, adults 18 to 49 for January 23rd, 29th. Number 1, Family Feud, one of my favorites. It's on a lot. Judge Judy. Something called Weekend Adventure, which is, I have no idea what that is. Wheel of Fortune, Jeopardy, Big Bang Theory, Law and Order, Big Bang Theory, Family Feud, and the Dr. Phil Show. So this tells you his household ratings, what days they're on. It also has a breakdown for women, too. Because that is an important demographic. And it just goes to show you can go to Screener.com and some other websites and get this kind of information and track where your favorite programs are at any given time. So that ends part 3 of Chapter 9, and that ends our video discussions for Chapter 9. This screen is one of many that used to appear on late night television when the station went off the air, and it's just a little broadcast screen. They broadcast along with the tone, and it was actually meant to help television engineers make sure the picture was recording or was broadcasting correctly. All those numbers and lines and grids mean something. Don't ask me what they mean, but over and out for us. Talk to you later.